Between 1835 and 1841, a church-operated children's asylum in Providence reported the disappearance of 18 minors under its care. The cases were documented individually, yet never publicly acknowledged as part of a broader pattern. Archived correspondences between state health officials and asylum staff were later restricted from public access, and no joint investigation was ever formally initiated. Today, few records survive. The institution was shut down in 1842, but no reason was ever officially stated. The St. Castulus Asylum for Indigent Youth opened in Providence in 1829, managed by a coalition of ecclesiastical authorities and private donors. Publicly, it was presented as a haven for abandoned or orphaned children, offering food, shelter, and moral instruction in a time before formal foster care existed. Sermons regularly praised the asylum's mission, and annual reports published in religious newspapers emphasized rising enrollment and community support. State officials occasionally toured the facility, often leaving with positive impressions and vague endorsements. Few questioned its internal operations, despite rare but recurring absences recorded in early attendance books. St. Castulus Asylum for Indigent Youth occupied a sloped parcel of land just beyond the northern edge of Providence's developed center, flanked by a low stone wall and an iron gate installed in 1832. The grounds included a main brick structure, a modest chapel, and several detached utility buildings. Morning bells marked the beginning of daily instruction, and by evening, candlelight from the dormitory windows signaled bedtime rituals were underway. The site had originally served as a boarding facility for aging clergy, but structural additions and funding from the Providence Charity Synod allowed it to convert into a youth asylum within a decade. Public documentation described the facility as housing between 40 and 60 children at any given time. These numbers fluctuated seasonally, particularly in winter months, when local parishes referred greater numbers of minors due to harsh living conditions in the surrounding boroughs. Intake forms were handwritten, stored in 2 leather-bound ledgers kept inside the asylum's south annex. Each record listed the child's name, approximate age, parish of origin, and reason for admittance, which was often noted as abandonment, destitution, or parental failure, a category left deliberately undefined by administrators. Father Reuben Layton served as the asylum's first director. Appointed in 1829, he had previously overseen clerical training at a regional seminary in upstate Connecticut. His appointment was not publicly contested. Internal records from the Charity Synod suggest he was selected due to his administrative consistency and his personal correspondence with several high-ranking figures in the regional ecclesiastical hierarchy. He arrived in Providence 3 months before the facility's official rededication and was granted full operational oversight without term limits or external review. Visitors to St. Castulus described the grounds as orderly but sparse. The main building featured long corridors of shared dormitories, classrooms fitted with wooden benches, and a central kitchen staffed by unpaid workers sourced from local congregations. There was no formal medical wing, but a retired physician, Henry Trowell, visited on Wednesdays to assess new arrivals. His reports, found in the archives of the Rhode Island Board of Public Welfare, consisted primarily of short health summaries, with occasional notations suggesting lack of nutrition or delayed development. No external body regularly audited these assessments. By the mid-1830s, the asylum's population had grown, though funding remained uneven. Annual reports to donors often referenced the institution's struggle to provide shoes, paper, or oil for lamps. Layton submitted expense summaries each December, itemized by category, but devoid of specific invoices. These summaries were reproduced in the Charity Synod's annual newsletter. Although donors occasionally questioned rising costs, the absence of a competing institution meant the asylum continued to receive both public goodwill and limited state appropriations. Officially, St. Castulus reported only 4 deaths between 1830 and 1840. All were described as due to seasonal illness or natural weakness, terms common in 19th century institutional language. However, attendance ledgers contained irregularities. On several occasions, names were crossed out without accompanying notation, In a few cases, marginal notes included vague phrases such as relocated per clerical order or transferred under emergency provision. These entries were not mirrored in correspondence with referring parishes. Some disappeared entirely from subsequent documentation, raising questions about record continuity. The physical design of the asylum facilitated restricted movement. Children were assigned to small groups by age and placed under the supervision of a rotating schedule of adult overseers. These supervisors, often referred to only by surname in reports, held informal authority over daily schedules and dormitory conduct. Reports filed by these staff members rarely extended beyond a paragraph, generally affirming compliance with routine or noting minor infractions. No formal training protocols for staff are known to have existed. In 1834, the Charity Synod received an unsigned letter claiming discrepancies in asylum enrollment figures. The letter, preserved in the private collection of a former board member, alleged that the number of children listed in public reports consistently exceeded the number observed by visiting clergy. The writer cited irregularities in chapel attendance and dormitory occupancy. The synod did not publish a response, and no record indicates the matter was pursued. The following year, public attention shifted to other regional concerns, and no further mention of the allegation appeared in ecclesiastical publications. Meanwhile, enrollment continued. Admissions rose during the economic recession of 1836, with parishes from as far as Pawtucket and Warwick submitting referrals. These children often arrived without accompanying documentation, relying solely on verbal confirmation from clergy or town representatives. While Father Layton was officially tasked with verifying each admission, anecdotal accounts from former volunteers suggest that many entries into the logbook occurred retroactively. Occasionally, names were added in clusters, each with identical handwriting and ink consistency, suggesting batch processing of data rather than contemporaneous recording. In 1837, Father Layton requested funds to construct a small detached building described in correspondence as a disciplinary annex. No architectural plans survive, but descriptions from contemporaries suggest it was made of timber, with a single corridor and 4 individual rooms. It stood behind the main building and had no separate access gate. The stated purpose was to isolate individuals who were habitually disruptive or in need of reflective solitude. Use of this facility was not publicly disclosed. The Charity Synod approved the funding with minimal inquiry. State welfare agents visited St. Castulus twice between 1835 and 1840. Both visits were unannounced and brief, each resulting in one-page summaries archived by the Board of Public Welfare. These documents affirm that children appeared generally well-groomed and that no obvious concern warranted immediate review. However, both visits occurred during scheduled worship sessions, and neither involved inspection of individual dormitories or consultation with non-clerical staff. By the standards of the time, such visits fulfilled basic oversight requirements. As early as 1838, discrepancies in internal records became harder to reconcile. Comparing intake ledgers with chapel attendance logs revealed several missing names. In a number of cases, a child would be recorded as admitted, then absent from every subsequent chapel log, meal roster, and class schedule. Notes such as transferred to private family or sent to regional home appeared sporadically, but without dates or corroborating details. None of these entries listed specific destinations, and no outgoing correspondence to such families exists in surviving archives. The removal process, if formalized, was undocumented. A review of annual reports from this period shows a growing reliance on the phrase, currently adjusting to updated census. That phrase appears 10 times between 1838 and 1841, often without explanation. Meanwhile, the number of named children listed in donor materials declined. By late 1840, the reports included only aggregate figures. Despite this shift, public commendations for the asylum continued in both religious and civic publications. In 1841, a final internal ledger entry marked a turning point. On November 2nd, an unnamed staff member made a notation in the margin of the intake log that read, 18th unexplained. No further elaboration was provided, and the handwriting did not match Father Layton's or any other identified contributor. The page contains no subsequent entries. This was the last known notation before the facility ceased public operations. In the months following the final intake entry of 1841, the grounds of St. Castellus fell into quiet disuse. No public statement announced its closure, and no transfer of remaining wards was documented in state or church records. Official publications from the Charity Synod continued through the end of that year, but included no reference to the asylum. Instead, attention shifted to unrelated philanthropic projects, including the expansion of a rural mission school and the creation of a widow's residence near Portuxet. For several years, the building remained intact. By spring of 1843, it was mentioned in a land use survey conducted by the Providence Board of Assessors. The survey described the property as unoccupied but maintained, with the main structure listed in stable condition. At the time, the city had no formal policy regarding the repurposing of private religious facilities, and ownership remained under the ecclesiastical trusteeship originally established by the Synod. A small stipend was allocated for groundskeeping, managed by a retired deacon residing nearby. His name, William Fairley, appears only once in connection with the site, and no direct testimony from him survives. The absence of public activity on the property did not pass unnoticed. Residents from the adjacent ward began reporting signs of occasional maintenance work, including chimney smoke on cold days and fresh wheel ruts leading up to the rear storage shed. However, without official reoccupation, these indicators were dismissed as the actions of caretakers or seasonal inspectors. No complaint was lodged with the city, and the building remained listed as exempt from taxation due to its religious ownership. In 1844, a visiting antiquarian from Boston included a brief description of the asylum site in a travel journal. The entry, later published in an academic review, characterized the structure as melancholic in posture, but well kept, with emphasis on the unbroken window panes and lack of visible deterioration. The author made no mention of its operational history, indicating that by that point, institutional memory of its function had already faded beyond common knowledge. That same year, the Rhode Island Historical Register conducted a review of disused properties with potential civic utility. St. Castellus appeared on the list as a candidate for conversion into a record archive. However, upon contacting the trustees, the committee received a brief reply stating that the facility was not presently available for secular rededication. No further inquiry was made, and the proposal was quietly shelved. Remaining documents from the asylum's active years entered limited circulation in subsequent decades. Several pages from the intake and attendance ledgers were found in the private archive of a Providence bookseller in 1871 during an estate sale. These documents were later acquired by a collector of regional ephemera, who noted in correspondence that portions of the records appeared to have been deliberately excised, with whole pages missing, and binding threads cut. The gaps correspond precisely to the years of peak intake and eventual closure. Discussions surrounding these missing materials never reached public forums. Within clerical networks, the fate of St. Castellus was occasionally referenced obliquely in sermons about historical transitions in charity work. One example, delivered in 1853 by Reverend Alan Desprez at St. Jure's Chapel, included the phrase, "We now know the limits of blind benevolence," widely interpreted as a nod to discontinued asylum practices. No transcript of the sermon was preserved, but press coverage affirmed it contained no specific allegations or revelations. By the late 1840s, the site had been removed from most municipal maps. It was referenced only in property registers and internal ecclesiastical inventories. Despite this, the structure remained physically untouched, with periodic minor repairs noted in handwritten invoices submitted to the Diocesan Finance Office. These invoices, though lacking detail, confirm the presence of contracted labor for tasks such as roof patching, cistern cleaning, and lock replacement. None refer to the movement of people or materials unrelated to structural upkeep. Efforts to reopen the facility in a different capacity surfaced briefly in 1851. A petition signed by 11 local residents proposed converting the building into an industrial school for boys. The petitions cited growing juvenile populations in the city and the absence of vocational training sites. However, correspondence from church officials declined the request, stating that the building retained a reserved designation not compatible with secular function. The meaning of this designation was never clarified in writing, and the matter was not pursued further. In academic circles, interest in the institution's history remained low. 19th-century compendiums of Rhode Island's charitable foundations rarely mentioned St. Castulus, and when they did, it was in passing. As an early example of ecclesiastical shelter services, one such reference, printed in 1879, incorrectly listed its closing date as 1837, suggesting that public record-keeping had already decoupled from actual timelines. That same entry referred to the facility as having merged with another mission, though no such merger is documented. Within church records, a small number of related entries appeared sporadically. A bishop's journal from 1862 included a notation reading, "Castulus Inventory Incomplete," logged after a routine inspection of diocesan holdings. The journal did not elaborate, but was filed alongside internal correspondence, noting a discrepancy in stored sacramental registers. These records make no reference to children, staff, or operational incidents, focusing instead on materials such as altar cloths, service books, and surplus liturgical items. By 1880, vegetation had overtaken most of the asylum's surrounding acreage. A photograph taken by a local surveyor shows the structure partially obscured by ivy, with the side annex visibly collapsing. At the time, the property was still listed under the same ecclesiastical trust, which had undergone several name changes but retained control over all sites designated prior to 1850. The building's physical decay did not appear to trigger action by the trustees, and no applications for demolition or redevelopment were filed. In 1891, a city committee once again approached the church with interest in acquiring the property for educational use. The committee's report described the building as structurally unsound but potentially salvageable. Their offer was rejected within 2 weeks. The written reply from the trust cited internal policies and unresolved inventories as barriers to transition. This phrasing, echoing earlier language from the bishop's journal, further suggests that certain record discrepancies remained unaddressed, though they were never formally identified. What remained of the asylum's documentation continued to drift into private collections. By 1895, a catalogue of religious holdings from the Providence Antiquarian Society included 5 items attributed to the asylum's original chapel, but none of them referenced children's services or related administrative details. Most surviving materials consisted of liturgical furniture and dated devotional texts. No staff logs, medical records, or correspondence folders from the operational years had surfaced by that time. As the century ended, the story of St. Castulus had effectively disappeared from public discourse. Its name appeared only as a footnote in ecclesiastical real estate filings and was no longer cited in philanthropic retrospectives. The land was eventually sold in 1902 under provisions that did not require disclosure of previous institutional use. A small commercial structure now occupies the site with no visible marker of its earlier function. The operational model of St. Castulus Asylum relied on a layered system of deference, both institutional and individual. Each procedural tier assumed the competence and moral clarity of the one above it. Parish officials who referred children to the asylum rarely followed up. Church administrators overseeing the charity synod deferred to Father Layton's internal documentation. Civic inspectors arrived with preset expectations of compliance and left with reports shaped by brevity and assumptions. This structure created a durable insulation from scrutiny, and within it, small irregularities often passed without formal notice. Among the earliest signs of concern were comments recorded in the margins of parish referral letters between 1835 and 1837. Several of these letters, preserved in local parish archives, contain annotations in different handwriting from the original authors. One letter from a Warwick cleric includes the note, "Not returned, no update received." Another from a Pawtucket rector bears the comment, "Inquiry made, no reply." These notes are undated and unsigned, suggesting they were added by administrative assistants or lower-ranking staff. None were ever followed by formal complaints or escalation through diocesan channels. The institution's correspondence ledger, found partially intact in a separate archive, includes repeated entries referencing unanswered inquiries. Between 1836 and 1839, at least 7 letters were sent to St. Castulus by parish offices seeking updates on former wards. The asylum's ledger acknowledges receipt of each letter, listing them by date and author. However, no outgoing responses are recorded for 4 of the entries. The others received replies described only as form acknowledgement. The content of those replies has not been recovered. Attendance inconsistencies also emerged within the chapel register. This ledger, maintained by rotating clerical staff, lists the names of children present for morning services. Beginning in late 1836, multiple names appear for 1 or 2 weeks, then vanish entirely. In some cases, the same name reappears months later, often misspelled or assigned a different age bracket. These entries, while not necessarily unusual in institutions with fluctuating enrollment, occurred frequently enough to prompt questions among occasional visiting clergy. One journal entry from a deacon who conducted a Sunday service in 1838 mentions several absentees not previously noted. No follow-up entry was ever made. An internal memo issued by Father Leighton in March 1837 addresses gaps in ledger continuity and directs staff to consolidate attendance entries weekly rather than daily. The stated goal was administrative efficiency. However, the change coincides with a sharp reduction in unique names appearing in the chapel register. After the new policy took effect, most entries became grouped under collective notations, such as all girls present or boys cohort observed. Individual identifiers were phased out almost entirely by the end of that year. The disciplinary annex, constructed in 1837 and referenced only in internal documents, presented another point of record omission. Though built with stated intent for short-term seclusion of disruptive individuals, no occupancy logs survive. A brief reference in the General Operations Report of 1838 confirms its existence and mentions the phrase rotating usage as needed, but provides no further clarity. None of the surviving ledgers or daily logs indicate which children were placed in the annex, for how long or under what conditions. It remained absent from visitor itineraries and was not included in site maps distributed during inspections. Even among support staff, knowledge of the annex's function was uneven. A memoir written decades later by a former volunteer named Elijah Rupp mentions an off-house used for quieting purposes, but does not describe its location or layout. Rupp's manuscript, unpublished during his lifetime, was discovered in a Providence attic in 1909 and later archived. His account is vague and reflective, offering limited insight into operations, but includes the observation that some children went there in the evening and were not always seen the next day. The statement is unsubstantiated and stands alone in his text. Irregular supply patterns also raised indirect questions. Procurement logs from 1835 through 1840 reveal sudden and unexplained shifts in provisioning. For example, orders for bedding and garments remained consistent through mid-1838, then declined sharply despite stable reported enrollment. Conversely, kitchen supply orders increased during the same period. An expense report from December 1839 lists a bulk purchase of preserves and dry goods, sufficient for nearly 80 individuals, though no population increase was noted that year. No explanation was provided in the records, and donor reports described operations as efficient and well-calibrated. The role of medical oversight remained minimal throughout the asylum's active years. Dr. Henry Trowell's weekly visits were noted in calendar entries, but not accompanied by formal reports beyond his early intake assessments. After 1836, references to his visits become irregular. By 1839, his name disappears from all known documents. A later entry in the Board of Public Welfare Correspondence from 1842 lists Trowell as retired and residing in Bristol, with no mention of his prior affiliation with St. Castulus. No formal contract or termination letter has been located. Additional signs of internal fragmentation surfaced in donor communication logs. Several correspondents between 1838 and 1840 inquired about visiting the site to observe operations. These letters, preserved in the Charity Synod's external engagement file, received delayed responses or were redirected without explanation. One donor from Massachusetts requested to sponsor a specific child and was told that the child had been relocated to a private parish household, though no such relocation appears in other records. The donor's follow-up inquiry received no reply, and subsequent contributions ceased. Training and supervision of staff also suffered from gaps in consistency. Letters of appointment for support personnel list varying durations and duties with no central protocol. Some hires received detailed task descriptions, while others were assigned roles marked only as general assistants. One surviving letter from 1836 assigns an individual to maintenance and child correspondence, a phrase that does not reappear in other staff assignments. This variability in role definition made tracing responsibility for specific administrative actions nearly impossible in later reviews. The lack of institutional memory was compounded by poor document preservation. By the time city officials attempted to review ecclesiastical property holdings in 1850, they found that many files associated with St. Castulus had been removed, misplaced, or mislabeled. The inventory list compiled during that review contains several blank entries next to key categories such as admissions, removals, and incident reports. Handwritten notations in the margins suggest missing or not found. No public explanation accompanied these gaps, and the matter did not proceed to formal inquiry. Throughout its operation, the asylum continued to receive praise in religious newsletters. Articles featured generic testimonials, often attributed to unnamed visitors, affirming the institution's commitment to faith-based compassion. These accounts focused on surface-level impressions, such as orderly dormitories or the sound of morning hymns. No article during the institution's active years acknowledged inconsistencies or sought external verification of reported figures. The editorial offices responsible for publishing these newsletters were affiliated with the same ecclesiastical network that oversaw the Charity Synod. In retrospect, the systemic structure of deference, omission, and assumed good faith created an administrative environment where anomalies could accumulate without triggering review. Each segment of oversight relied on unverified assumptions, and gaps in documentation were attributed to clerical delay or limited resources rather than considered indicative of deeper procedural failure. This inertia allowed the institution to operate without comprehensive accountability, even as signs of irregularity became increasingly difficult to reconcile. By 1840, internal activity at St. Castulus entered a phase of apparent retrenchment. Staff rotation increased without public notice, and several names recorded in early personnel rosters disappeared from payroll submissions. The quarterly compensation reports submitted to the Charity Synod showed a marked reduction in listed employees. Where once 10 or 12 workers were noted by name and function, entries by that year were reduced to 4 or 5, with general designations such as clerical support or grounds services. No resignations or terminations were recorded. The asylum's education logs mirrored this shift. In earlier years, lesson plans and pupil progress summaries were appended to each month's teaching report. These pages described basic literacy, arithmetic, and religious instruction, noting individual children by first name and detailing their improvement or areas of concern. However, logs from late 1839 onward became increasingly vague. Monthly reports were reduced to a single paragraph, affirming that classes were held as scheduled and that general objectives were met. No child names appear in the final 3 reports preserved in the diocesan archive. The physical state of the building, according to sporadic inspection memos, remained unchanged. Notes from a church steward's visit in July 1840 described the floors as swept, the windows intact, and the dormitories in suitable condition. The memo made no reference to occupancy levels, nor did it include any comment on student activity. A follow-up inspection scheduled for October was cancelled without explanation. This absence of detail was consistent with a growing trend of non-specificity in all communications related to the institution. Clerical correspondence during the same period further illustrates the retreat from external engagement. Letters that had previously included summaries of child welfare and development instead focused on logistical concerns, such as repairs to the chapel's roof and a delay in the delivery of lantern oil. These letters were signed by an assistant rather than by Father Leighton himself, whose name ceased appearing in outgoing correspondence after November 1840. A record from the Charity Synod dated January 1841 includes the note, "Leighton on extended retreat," with no further elaboration. In the place of detailed institutional updates, church periodicals began promoting other charitable endeavors. Notices of new mission schools and parish food distributions began to dominate the Charity Synod's public communications. References to the asylum were phased out without formal closure statements. By spring 1841, no published material contained any mention of St. Castellus, and no updated figures on enrollment, health or education were provided to donors. The financial records from this final phase show a significant decline in external donations. Where prior years had included line items from private families, local businesses, and affiliated parishes, the 1841 ledger lists only 2 contributions, both anonymous. Simultaneously, the expenditure side of the ledger reflects lower activity, with basic operational costs trimmed to what would be expected for building maintenance rather than full-scale occupancy. These changes occurred without formal budget revision or explanation. A final recorded act of oversight came from an ecclesiastical appointee named Edmund Cowley, whose memorandum dated October 1841 described a walkthrough of the facility. Cowley noted the presence of clean floors, stocked cupboards and lit stoves, but made no mention of staff or residents. His tone was procedural, with no evaluative commentary. His final line reads simply, "All structures accounted for." The memorandum was filed without further discussion. Shortly after Cowley's visit, all remaining scheduled correspondence regarding the institution ceased. No further ledger entries, budget items, or staff memos referencing the asylum have been found dated after November 1841. An unmarked envelope stored in the diocesan archive, dated 2 months later, contains the key to the front gate, wrapped in cloth and labeled only Castulus. There is no indication of who delivered it or why it was stored separately from other property keys. The silence that followed was institutional and enduring. While some former staff likely remained within the broader ecclesiastical network, few left recorded statements regarding their time at the facility. Interviews conducted decades later by civic historians failed to produce substantive first-hand accounts. Individuals contacted through parish rosters from the 1840s either declined to speak or claimed limited recollection of specific procedures or personnel assignments. No surviving documentation links any staff member directly to the facility's final months. Attempts to reconstruct the child population based on parish referrals proved inconclusive, while incoming records from individual churches list children's names and dates of transfer to the asylum. Outgoing confirmations are rare. Several parishes included the notation "no return" or "not reclaimed" next to certain names, but made no effort to determine outcome. A handful of children listed in early intake ledgers reappear in later civic records, but the majority vanish from documented history after entry. Questions regarding oversight responsibility arose briefly during a diocesan audit in 1843. The audit, prompted by unrelated financial discrepancies, included a section titled Archived Operations. Within that section, a single page addressed the St. Castulus site. The page includes a hand-drawn diagram of the property and a short list of unresolved categories, including census variance and ledger discontinuity. No corrective action is noted. The audit was filed and approved without public comment. By 1845, the property was referenced only in logistical correspondence. Letters between church administrators and municipal surveyors concerned only boundary lines and usage designations. The building was referred to generically as the Northern Tract Facility or the closed site. These references were strictly operational and included no historical data or reference to the asylum's former function. The language was consistent with broader trends in mid-century ecclesiastical property management, where dormant structures were maintained but culturally unacknowledged. In a final archived notation dated 1848, a church property manager logged a request to have the structure removed from official site rotation. The request stated that no future programmatic use is anticipated, and that the building would be maintained only to prevent deterioration. The request was approved, and the facility remained in ecclesiastical possession until the early 20th century. No additional use was recorded, and no commemorative or explanatory plaque was ever installed. The pattern of missing documentation from St. Castulus was first observed not by civic officials or investigators, but by a group of librarians working on a regional historical survey in 1872. Their task was to catalogue early charitable institutions across Rhode Island for a centennial publication. As they gathered archival materials from municipal and ecclesiastical sources, they encountered notable gaps in the records tied to the Providence district, specifically between 1835 and 1841. When reviewing known religious shelters from that time, St. Castulus stood out for the brevity and vagueness of its surviving files. One member of the survey team, Miriam Edlin, noted the institution's absence from local newspaper obituaries, school registration logs, and parish announcements during its final operational year. Her findings were included in a footnote of the final publication, where she referred to St. Castulus as a facility whose history concludes with silence. At the time, this remark did not attract attention, but her personal notes, archived separately, provide evidence of her broader concerns. These notes detail her difficulty tracing children whose names appear in early referral letters, many of whom had no later civic or ecclesiastical presence. Among the names Edlin attempted to verify was that of Charles R. Sy, listed as arriving at the asylum in 1836 at age 9. A letter from his home parish confirms his transfer and describes his health as fair. Yet no school, work, or marriage record bearing his name appears in Rhode Island or the surrounding counties after that date. Similar gaps existed for two siblings transferred from North Providence in 1837. The absence of follow-up documentation for these individuals stood out in an era where civic engagement, military enlistment, and census rolls typically produced at least some traceable entries. Edlin's research prompted a short-lived effort by the Rhode Island Historical Society to assemble a more detailed chronology of the asylum's operation. Correspondence from that period reveals that while some members advocated for deeper inquiry, others viewed the endeavor as speculative and unproductive. A letter from the Society's board, dated March 1874, suggests limiting focus to institutions with concrete documentary trails. As a result, no formal investigation was conducted. The Edlin notes remained unpublished, and references to the institution in public histories remained peripheral. In 1885, a separate but related development occurred when the estate of a former diocesan administrator was opened for inventory. Among his papers were found several sealed folders labeled with property names, one of which read Castulus. Inside were fragments of correspondence, internal memos, and a partial floor plan of the asylum's annex. While the majority of the documents were routine in nature, one page drew particular attention. It was a handwritten note from a church clerk, undated, reading only, "Accounts unresolved, movement not reflected in returns, discrepancy persists." No names or specifics were included. The documents were reviewed by a probate appointee and subsequently turned over to church authorities, where they were logged under archival holdings but not added to public inventories. A copy of the annex floor plan, however, was retained by the appointee, who shared it with a local academic researching ecclesiastical architecture. This plan became the first physical representation of the annex to surface publicly, showing a narrow corridor, 4 individual rooms, and a small enclosed yard. The structure appeared self-contained, with a separate chimney and no internal connection to the main building. This floor plan drew renewed attention from architectural historians, several of whom questioned why such a facility was constructed at a time when asylum operations rarely included segregated spaces of this nature. In a lecture given at the Rhode Island Institute of Design in 1890, Professor Lambert H. Ames referred to the annex as an anomaly in structure and purpose. His comments sparked correspondence among other researchers, but few were willing to speculate beyond design features. By then, most institutional records had already been dispersed, withheld, or lost. The annex's apparent role in institutional operations remained unclarified. No journal entries, memos, or usage logs reference activities within its walls. One indirect mention in a supply list dated 1838 includes an order for 4 small basins for side rooms, which some interpreted as referencing the annex. However, there is no accompanying layout or context to confirm that interpretation. The building itself had long since deteriorated, and by the time researchers began requesting access to the site, the original structure had been replaced with commercial development. Interest in the asylum's missing records resurfaced briefly in 1896, following the publication of a citywide census reconciliation report. The report, designed to trace early population movement into urban Providence, identified a set of anomalies in mid-19th century child demographics. Specifically, the report noted a decline in recorded juvenile census entries that could not be attributed to known health events, migration patterns, or institutional transfers. A margin comment by the report's compiler reads, "Gap coincides with St. Castulus' operational peak, unaccounted entries unresolved." Despite the note, no official follow-up occurred. The compiler, J. Chosrick Fielding, did not publish additional commentary on the topic, though he is known to have written privately to the diocesan archivist requesting access to closed holdings. His letter, preserved in the diocesan reply log, received a formal response declining the request. The cited reason was confidentiality and spiritual discretion, with no indication that the archive's contents were incomplete or contested. Fielding did not pursue the matter further and turned his attention to other statistical anomalies in city infrastructure planning. That same year, an academic article by historian Lina Havisham proposed a typology of early institutional closures in Rhode Island. Her study placed St. Castulus among facilities that had ceased function without structural reassignment or formal dissolution. In her classification system, these institutions were distinct from those absorbed into other networks or repurposed for alternate use. Havisham labeled St. Castulus an example of quiet abandonment, where institutional cessation occurred through non-declaration and lack of successor oversight. The article noted that such closures often left little trace, as successor agencies had no mandate to preserve unacknowledged histories. Havisham's work was praised for its methodological clarity, but received limited public interest. Her references to missing records, discrepancies in child placements, and annex architecture remained academic points rather than prompts for renewed examination. Even among historians, the idea of institutional disappearance through administrative silence was largely accepted as an artifact of the period's loose bureaucratic frameworks. No policy mechanism existed to compel redisclosure or retroactive correction, and few officials in the late 19th century regarded historical omissions as actionable concerns. By the final decade of the century, discussion of St. Castulus had receded again. Its absence from commemorative volumes and public directories ensured that institutional memory would remain dormant. Except for scattered references in specialized archives and scholarly footnotes, the asylum faded from civic recognition. The individuals associated with its operation had either retired or passed away, and no new initiatives sought to recover their testimonies or clarify unresolved questions. In this climate of limited scrutiny, the institution's unexplained records remained unexamined. Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. In 1898, during the early planning phase for a public archive of Rhode Island's early educational institutions, an unexpected document surfaced among papers previously held in private family storage. The source was the estate of Ezra Winthrop, a merchant whose civic appointments included brief service on the Providence School Board. The document in question was a folded report, unsigned, listing the names of children admitted to St. Castulus between 1835 and 1840. Though incomplete and containing several inconsistencies, it provided more detail than any other list then available. This list, titled only Intakes by Year, itemized children by first name and approximate age, grouped into annual batches. Unlike other surviving ledgers, it included notations in a second hand, likely made later. Most entries had short comments in the margin, including phrases such as chapel seen, referred twice, or record ends. 18 of the names lacked follow-up notes entirely. These were the only entries in the list without any form of marginalia. The absence was not marked or explained. Archivists tasked with reviewing the Winthrop materials cross-referenced the list with known church documents and civil registries. Of the 18 unannotated names, none appeared in later city census rolls, parish confirmation records, or known school rosters. Moreover, there were no hospital, cemetery, or emigration files corresponding to these individuals within Rhode Island. These absences triggered internal discussion among the archive staff, but due to the age and unofficial nature of the document, no external notification was made. The list was catalogued under Non-Confirmed Intake Record and filed without publication. Privately, two of the archivists began assembling a correlation chart to track potential document overlaps across other institutions. Their aim was to determine whether any children listed without follow-up in St. Castulus records might have been transferred, knowingly or otherwise, to other facilities. Their search extended to orphanages, mission schools, and parish boarding houses from the same decade. While some names shared similar spelling or phonetics with children in those other logs, there was no verifiable match. In multiple cases, the ages and places of origin diverged beyond reconciliation. One archivist, Samuel Drown, kept a private record of these inquiries, which he intended for future academic use. His notes include references to the annex floor plan and citations from earlier inspection memos. In a margin comment from June 1899, he wrote, "In these few pages, perhaps the only continuity left, no clear handoff, no designation of closure, no terms of release." The comment, preserved in his field ledger, was not submitted to the archive's official files and remains the only known internal expression of concern tied directly to the Winthrop list. By the early 20th century, institutional protocols had shifted away from retrospective review. As state systems of record-keeping formalized, early religious institutions were gradually decoupled from centralized oversight. A statewide inventory of historical asylums compiled in 1903 acknowledged the existence of St. Castulus, but classified it as non-continuous, records presumed lost. The brief entry includes no names and lists its operational dates only as pre-census. Without direct challenges or public requests, the classification was not contested. During this period, the property that once housed the facility was quietly sold. The transaction took place in 1902, brokered through a third party representing ecclesiastical interests. The deed lists only the lot number and square footage, omitting the site's former institutional use. Subsequent building permits refer to the location only as a commercial parcel. Construction began in early 1903, and the structure that replaced the original asylum bore no visual resemblance to its predecessor. The annex had already deteriorated by that time and was not mentioned in any surveyor's documentation. At the same time, a few remnants of the institution's administrative history began entering private circulation. A Providence antiquities dealer catalogued a brass desk plate engraved Reverend R. Layton, Provi. Though unverified, the dealer's notes claimed it was retrieved from a clerical auction held in the 1860s. Another item, a bound ledger with the title Daily Chapels, was sold to a collector in New Haven. Photographs of its interior pages confirm that the ledger ended abruptly in October 1840, with several pages removed near the end. These items, while fragmentary, were among the last physical artifacts tied to the facility to appear in public view. In academic publications, references to St. Castulus continued to decline. The institution did not appear in the 1912 Compendium of New England Benevolent Societies, nor was it included in the 1924 exhibit catalogue for the Rhode Island Centennial of Education. The few mentions that remained were limited to footnotes in theological studies or ecclesiastical real estate histories. Even within those texts, the asylum was characterized as an early, experimental venture that lacked sustained relevance. Meanwhile, the private notes compiled by researchers such as Edlin Drown and Havisham remained uncollated. Scattered across archival boxes, university holdings, and personal files, they constituted the most detailed attempt to trace institutional inconsistencies, yet no coordinated effort ever brought them into synthesis. As generations passed, access to these materials narrowed, with some becoming restricted due to donor stipulations or archival policy shifts. None were digitized or widely circulated. The last known public reference to the asylum's intake list appeared in a regional genealogy journal in 1931. The article, focused on migration patterns among children in coastal Rhode Island, included a brief table with partial data from the Winthrop papers. The editor added a disclaimer, noting that the origin and accuracy of the list could not be confirmed. No subsequent correspondence about the entry appears in the journal's archives. By mid-century, both the name and function of St. Castulus were absent from community awareness. Generations living in the neighborhood surrounding the former site had no reference to the building's past. Oral histories collected during the 1950s from longtime residents describe only an old schoolhouse or church storage. None mentioned an asylum. Without signage, markers, or institutional descendants, there remained no mechanism for reintroduction into civic memory. As a result, the unresolved intakes, the annex records, and the sequence of administrative omissions faded from visibility. The materials that might have clarified procedures, responsibilities, or outcomes were never gathered into a unified account. Their separation across decades and formats ensured that continuity could not be restored without explicit institutional will, which never materialized. By the close of the century, the story of St. Castulus existed only as a partial narrative, accessible through independent collation of disjointed fragments. While several historians cited its absence as indicative of broader patterns of record attrition and administrative opacity, no comprehensive reconstruction was undertaken. The names on the Winthrop list remained unverified. No inquiries were reopened. The discrepancies persisted only as notations in marginalia, logged but unexamined. In the years following the complete disappearance of St. Castulus from public records, historical inquiry into its operations became a marginal pursuit. The absence of definitive closure, combined with the fragmentary state of surviving documentation, relegated the institution to occasional footnotes in regional surveys. While the architectural outline remained faintly visible in early land maps and a handful of church files, no formal preservation effort addressed the physical site. Instead, attention turned to other, better documented institutions whose trajectories conformed to known administrative patterns. By 1957, during an academic conference on 19th-century child welfare held at Brown University, a session on institutional record-keeping included a brief mention of St. Castulus. The speaker, an archivist from a Boston seminary, presented a comparative chart showing lengths of operation for various facilities. St. Castulus was the only entity listed with both an unspecified end date and an unknown number of transferred wards. An asterisk at the bottom of the chart labeled it as data unavailable. No attendees raised questions about the entry, and the session proceeded without further reference. The archivist later clarified in correspondence that the inclusion was intended as illustrative of lost administrative continuity rather than of specific procedural concern. His original research had drawn only from publicly listed directories, most of which had long ceased to include the asylum by the turn of the century. He noted that the entry was added to highlight gaps in the historical record, not to raise suspicion or provoke inquiry. His files contained no additional documents from the site. By the 1970s, interest in 19th-century institutions expanded within the context of broader academic studies in urbanization and governance. Several university theses referenced St. Castulus in sections addressing defunct charitable models. These citations were largely descriptive, noting its early foundation and unexplained closure. None proposed further investigation. In bibliographies, the asylum was grouped with other institutions labeled as unsustained initiatives. A consensus emerged that its closure was likely due to administrative consolidation or financial insolvency, though no formal analysis supported either conclusion. During the same period, changes in archival policy led to the reclassification of some ecclesiastical holdings. Previously restricted materials entered public viewing schedules, including several boxes marked Charity Operations, Providence District. These boxes contained duplicate copies of known donor lists, chapel supply logs, and a collection of unsigned memos relating to property maintenance. A small set of items labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence was later reviewed by a graduate student conducting independent research on early institutional floor plans. Among these papers was a note, dated 1841, referencing the closure of side-use facilities. The phrase was not defined and no additional context was provided. The note, written in abbreviated script, was preserved but not indexed in the main archival catalogue. It remained in an unmarked folder until a 1982 filing project brought it into renewed visibility. The project, which aimed to digitize key pre-1850 documents, reviewed the note as part of an internal memo about abandoned sites. However, due to its limited legibility and absence of corroborating files, the document was deemed inconclusive and was not selected for reproduction. It remains in storage, accessible only by request. Meanwhile, urban development continued to erase physical traces of the institution. By the 1990s, the original site of the asylum had undergone several commercial iterations. Early in the decade, construction for a municipal parking structure required subsurface surveying. The contracted firm filed a report with the city planner, noting the discovery of brickwork consistent with mid-19th century foundation lines. The report includes 2 black and white photographs and a drawn approximation of the underlying footprint. Though not publicly associated with St. Castulus at the time, the dimensions match those recorded in early architectural sketches. The construction report was submitted without commentary on historical significance. The structure proceeded as planned, and no preservation efforts were undertaken. The photographs were included in the city's project archive, but were not cross-referenced with any prior ecclesiastical records. Without official designation as a historical site, the former asylum grounds passed fully into commercial use. As digitization of archives advanced into the early 2000s, occasional metadata tagging brought fragments of St. Castulus into broader databases. For example, a grant-funded project to digitize early American parish correspondence included 3 scanned letters referencing the institution. These were made accessible through a university library portal, but lacked context or annotations. In queries submitted by users, the asylum was occasionally flagged as a research interest, though none of the queries yielded sufficient material for standalone projects. During a 2011 workshop on institutional disappearance and archival silence, held at the Rhode Island Historical Society, a brief session discussed St. Castulus in the context of non-continuous care institutions. The presentation highlighted the limited records available and cited it as a case of unresolved administrative succession. Participants discussed methodological approaches for addressing such gaps, but the session concluded without proposing action or follow-up. The institution's name did not appear on the formal agenda and was mentioned only during the open discussion period. Throughout this time, scattered public references persisted, though increasingly detached from historical frameworks. A local heritage blog in 2014 featured a post titled "Buildings That Vanished," which included an entry on the asylum site based on speculative accounts from neighborhood interviews. The article reproduced an aerial photograph showing the outline of the parking structure and noted without citation that a former school or church once stood there. No reference was made to asylum operations, and the post was archived without revision. One of the few attempts to synthesize known data occurred in 2017, when a graduate student in information science compiled a digital exhibit on lost institutions of Providence. The exhibit, hosted on a university platform, included a section titled "St. Castulus and the Records That Weren't." Drawing from scattered documents, personal correspondence, and archived ledger photographs, The exhibit presented a timeline of known entries, absences, and final mentions. Though it provided no new documentation, it represented the first consolidated attempt to outline the institution's disappearance. The digital exhibit remained online for 2 years before the hosting agreement expired. During that time, it received modest engagement and was cited once in a research paper on archival omissions. After its removal, the materials reverted to private files held by the university's Digital Humanities Department. No further funding was allocated for its renewal or update. The student who created the project did not pursue the topic in future academic work. Institutionally, St. Castulus now exists primarily through citation networks. These include brief mentions in indices of closed properties, scattered notes in diocesan inventories, and unconfirmed annotations in public archive margins. The lack of formal closure or comprehensive summary continues to render it administratively incomplete. Without resolution or official classification, it remains unaccounted for in both historical narratives and policy documentation. As academic focus in the early 2020s shifted toward the study of bureaucratic disappearance and historical omission, St. Castulus began to appear with greater frequency in research on institutional silences. Unlike sites marked by abrupt closure or public scandal, it presented a case in which no central event, policy, or controversy had been recorded. The gaps, spread across decades, involved neither public protest nor legal review. Scholars began referring to it as a model of what some termed passive archival withdrawal, where the cessation of documentation functioned as a de facto conclusion. In 2021, a collaborative working group formed at a Midwestern university to examine early child welfare institutions in New England. Among its findings was a short profile on St. Castulus that drew together more than 50 fragmentary references from municipal directories, private letters, donation ledgers, and church audits. The profile noted the disappearance of named individuals from ledgers, the lack of closure correspondence, and the spatial segregation of records. Still, the group's stated mission did not include publication. The research remained internal and circulated only among affiliated scholars. That same year, a digitized version of the annex floor plan was added to a publicly accessible archive, hosted by a regional consortium of architectural historians. The plan, labeled simply Detached Structure Providence 1837, was accompanied by a brief annotation suggesting use as an auxiliary space for unsupervised confinement. The annotation emphasized the lack of corroborating records and encouraged viewers to submit any related documentation. No submissions were received in the following 18 months. Among civic historians, references to the institution became emblematic of lost civic oversight during a period when regulatory mechanisms were minimal. Lectures on the evolution of charitable governance used St. Castulus as an example of reliance on informal reporting and trust-based operation. These talks emphasized that during the first half of the 19th century, operational continuity often depended more on sustained attention than on formal policy. When interest waned, institutions could recede without triggering procedural checks. Public knowledge of the site remained low. In a 2022 community survey of historical awareness, fewer than 1% of respondents identified St. Castulus by name. When shown photographs of early Providence buildings, none could link the image of the main asylum structure to its purpose or date. A minority recalled hearing of a church school, but were unable to name its location. None connected the name to missing records or historical inconsistencies. Meanwhile, digitized municipal datasets introduced new opportunities for data mapping. Researchers exploring early child placement networks in Rhode Island used machine-readable ledgers to trace enrollment patterns, referral frequencies, and clerical correspondences. St. Castulus appeared in fewer than 20 entries, all of which ended in the year 1841. The entries were marked as closed cases. Annotations added by the data team noted that N status was listed as undefined for each entry. This variable was flagged but not investigated further. By 2023, remaining material references to the institution consisted of 5 physical objects and 6 confirmed archival folders held across 4 collections. None of the items had been consolidated or indexed under a shared keyword. 3 of the folders had restricted access due to institutional policy. One contained donor correspondence from the late 1830s, another housed property assessments for non-secular holdings, and the third included routine maintenance forms. While none explicitly addressed enrollment irregularities, each made brief mention of activity at the site. Efforts to secure a historical marker at the former location were proposed in a City Council subcommittee hearing in early 2024. The proposal included the text of a commemorative plaque describing the institution's establishment, public reputation, and unknown closure timeline. During discussion, concerns were raised about the clarity of the historical record and the absence of first-hand accounts. The motion was tabled pending further review. No follow-up was scheduled. An independent archive project, initiated later that year by a non-profit research collective, aimed to create an open-access index of incomplete child welfare records in the Northeast United States. St. Castulus was included in the pilot batch of 10 case studies. The project outlined a timeline of recorded events, administrative gaps, and known archival materials. It also compiled metadata tags for names appearing in surviving ledgers, including the 18 intake entries without recorded exits. These tags were designed to enable cross-database comparisons, though no matches were found in linked parish or census datasets. A companion essay published alongside the index argued that the asylum's vanishing footprint reflected not a cover-up, but a gradual disengagement from record continuity. The authors framed the case as symptomatic of broader systemic norms in which documentation was viewed as secondary to service delivery. Without an incentive to standardize tracking, institutional transitions could unfold without definitive resolution. The essay stopped short of interpreting the missing names as evidence of misconduct, citing insufficient documentation to support such conclusions. Public commentary on the index was limited. A short article appeared in a regional journal of religious history, calling the profile a useful aggregation of disparate data. An editorial in a city newspaper briefly referenced the findings, stating that the Providence of 1841 was a place with no formal retention policy, no obligation to report, and no expectation that temporary institutions would explain their ends. The article did not suggest further inquiry. In current digital heritage platforms, searches for St. Castulus yield only aggregate mentions. The institution appears as a node in network maps showing child transfer pathways between 1825 and 1850. It is referenced in tags associated with undesignated closure, non-secular intake, and low follow-through rate. The metadata aligns with other facilities that ceased operation without stated outcome. In visualizations, these nodes are marked in gray, denoting archival incompletion. No physical preservation of the site has occurred. The lot remains occupied by commercial infrastructure, and no surface markings indicate prior institutional use. Development plans for the surrounding area include no reference to historical commemoration. Inquiries submitted to city planning boards receive form replies stating that no records exist, confirming the nature of previous structures. Heritage designation proposals must include certified documentation of significance, which no applicant has yet assembled. The legacy of St. Castulus, as it currently exists, is limited to small-scale academic reference, isolated archival fragments, and intermittent citations in research on early childcare systems. Its role in local history has not been integrated into educational materials, civic exhibitions, or cultural programming. The lack of public closure has neither hindered urban growth nor drawn sustained media attention. As an institution, its procedural memory ended without resolution. The children listed in its final ledgers, the records annotated with unexplained terms, and the correspondence filed without reply all remain within archival thresholds but outside public discourse. Without centralized documentation or a definitive event, the institution persists only through residual citations and deferred questions. The silence, distributed across formats and time periods, functions as a conclusion without pronouncement. Text. But we insist on remembering